Yes.
Coffee, donuts, I appreciate that. Thank you, whoever got coffee. You're an angel, a wonderful human. And very, very excited. The Seattle channel is here again, and they think they have figured out a configuration with audio where we can just sit and talk and people will hear us, and it'll be wonderful. So thank you very much, folks, for helping set that up. And they'll let us know if there's any sort of technical stuff with that setup this morning. We're in meeting 3 already, and I'm facilitating today. A lot of what this meeting is going to come to is the start of a process. We're going to start making some decisions together, which is very exciting. The central staff is here, and thank you all for all your hard work and prep. So we have 6 briefings today that have a mixture of considerations. So with that, we'll have some considerations around a continuation of some considerations with employee hours tax, but also other progressive tax sources. So they're going to give us an overview for some considerations there. And then we're also going to have a discussion on 2 levels of considerations that have come out of the use caucus convenings. That one is around what it is to look at housing inventory and service and shelter provision for those who are currently in houseless. And then the other level is some considerations for those who are currently housed but perhaps a crisis away from being homeless, and what it is to stabilize affordable housing infrastructure for those individuals. And there will be a continuation of some of those pieces and briefings in meeting 4 the next time. But this should give us a really deep grounding, and then we're going to actually break into small groups that'll be cross-caucus groups to have some discussions and have some folks start reporting out about where you're feeling, where we're at, and some decisions about what will move forward. Just a reminder, generally, ultimately, this is all going to go into 2 processes with the City Council and committees. And so one is that there's going to be reporting going out. And do we have a timeline on when that first reporting is going out to the committee?
The Finance Committee is meeting next week.
Brilliant, thank you. And so that's one consideration. So the work up to this point will be part of that. And then the other piece is that all of our recommendations will go into the written report, which will be sort of, our recommendations to that body as a whole. So with that, we were hoping folks could give report outs on the caucus. I believe both caucuses had an opportunity to meet between meeting 2 and meeting 3. So let's start though with a go around of names. If folks could just say your name and which caucus or caucuses you're a part of, just to orient everyone and introduce ourselves again. Do you mind starting, Katie, on this side, and we'll loop around this way?
Yes, Katie Wilson, Transit Riders Union, and I'm in both caucuses.
Thank you.
I'm Lisa Dugard with the Public Defender Association. I am underperforming only with the Revenue Use Caucus.
Courtney O'Toole, Nicholsville Share Wheel, and Revenue Use Caucus.
Thank you.
Josiah Wards, Cafe Red, and Martin Luther King Business Association, and I, as of like 2 days ago, just joined the Revenue Caucus.
Daniel Malone with the ESC, and I've been in the Use Caucus.
Eric Sun, Council Central Staff, no caucus.
Tracy Rassiff, Council Center Staff, no caucus.
Alan Lee, Council Central Staff, ditto.
Lorena Gonzalez.
Lisa Herbold, represented by Shannon Perez Darby in the Revenue Caucus.
Wonderful. Kirsten Harris Talley, Community Co-Chair, and then I've also been part of the Use Caucus.
Tony Toe with Homestead. Unfortunately, I signed up for the Revenue Caucus, but I was out of town last week and missed the meeting, so apologize for that.
Bree Little from Real Change Homeless Empowerment Project, and I'm in the Revenue Use Caucus.
Michael Winkler-Chin with the Seattle Chinatown International District Preservation and Development Authority, the Revenue Caucus.
Tom Matthews, representing the Low Income Housing Institute and business owners, and I'm on the Revenue Committee.
Ian Eisenberg, Uncle Ike, small business owner, and I'm on both caucuses.
Samantha Grad, UFCW 21, and I'm on the Revenue Caucus.
Andrew Cote, DESC, and I'm on both caucuses.
Jennifer Adams, Scofflaw Mitigation Team, the Bridge Care Center. I'm on the Revenue Use Caucus.
Wonderful.
Ashley Harrison with the Legislative Department. No caucus.
Just keeping us all organized and informed. So thank you for that. That's no small task. And thank you to all the folks who are giving time to this task force and those individual caucuses. It's very much appreciated. So with that, is there a report out from the Revenue Caucus? Anything to share with the group? Any highlights? Katie, please.
So we met on last Friday, perhaps I should have brought some printed materials, but we had a discussion of the employee hours tax and several variations thereof. The most interesting thing for me that came out of that was it sounds like it might be possible to do that tax not only, as we've discussed, as a flat amount per employee, but perhaps also it could be done as a percentage of total payroll. And so we sort of discussed both of those approaches and some, perhaps pluses and minuses to each one. We also discussed several other progressive revenue ideas, and Dan was there giving us not legal advice, but some general feelings about those ideas. That's about it. I won't go into more detail on that right now.
Thank you. I should have asked before, but would anyone other than me like to give a report out from the Youth Caucus? I'm happy to do it if no one else wants to, but you want to share? Okay, I'll do it. That's fine. We had a really in-depth conversation about sort of the breadth of the lay of the land around housing and service infrastructure need, and how to hone it down into some of the prioritization of the most relevant needs. So with that, we had deep discussion about proposed solutions for those currently homeless, and that our solution priorities there are building permanent housing and support shelter and services for transition into housing. And so with that, we have a total of 4 considerations, some of which will be part of what the central staff briefed us on today. And then we also had proposed solutions for those currently housed but a crisis away from homelessness. And the solution priority there was a retention of current housing and keeping affordability with housing inventory, and considerations of what's truly affordable for folks. So with that, we have 2 considerations and solutions that will be reviewed today. So we feel pretty confident from that we have our general places that we think revenue could be utilized and used, that will have some pretty clear numbers tied to it for consideration. Did I miss anything? Anyone else who was there? Okay. Wonderful. Just checking my agenda here. So with that, I think we'll roll right into policy briefs from the central staff. And my understanding is that we're going to start with revenues and costs assessment, correct?
Sounds about right to me. I'm
Okay,
handing out
wonderful.
something here.
Thank you.
I forget exactly how my bit here is billed on the agenda, but what I've come prepared to speak to is a number of questions that were submitted from task force members about, primarily about other kinds of revenue options that might be pursued either instead or in addition to employee hours type tax, although I'm also prepared to speak to tax of that sort. One particular question we had was about a report, and I forget the name of the full report, but it's from the Center for American Progress. I think it dated to 2014. And the gist of the question was, they've got recommendations for progressive taxation. What are we doing? What are we doing about along the lines of the actions that are recommended by the center? And I think kind of by implication, which ones might have might be more suitable to the circumstances that the city is in. We also had a couple of questions about other alternatives that were not a part of that report, and so I've kind of lumped them in together here on this handout that I just sent around. And so my plan is just to kind of walk through some of the major areas that are included in that report and identify in kind of a very high level, conceptual level, again, I don't want to get into the game as Dan didn't during the caucus meeting last week of, I'm not your legal counsel, but I will try to indicate in very broad strokes the sort of first blush range of obstacles that some of these options might face, as well as some of the kind of more practical side issues that might not be about legality, but rather about administration or ability to determine the level of resources that it might produce or something like that. And I would also note that the recommendations of the Center for American Progress both include some actions that this task force might recommend the city take in order that would produce more revenue. However, there are certain parts that are of that report that are recommending actions that would, rather than producing more revenue, would potentially increase the overall level of progressiveness or progressivity, whatever the expression would be, of the city's tax structure, but would actually potentially reduce the level of revenues the city's collecting if taken in a vacuum. That is to say, they have some recommendations where you would about the reduction of regressive taxes. But if the council were, or rather, if the task force were to recommend it, the council and the mayor were to put into place those changes in a vacuum, that would actually reduce the level of resources available for some of the purposes we've been discussing. So just want to bear in mind that there's two broad categories in that sense. So the first thing that's identified in the CAP report is, or rather recommended, is reforms to property taxes. Some examples of that include homestead exemptions, which are offered in many states and essentially exempt the first X 100,000 or X 10,000, some number of value of a given property when used as a residence from taxation. So, for example, some states might say, if you live in a property and it's your home, then the first $100,000 of value is simply not taxed. Another example of a policy that they recommend is to provide tax credits against property tax based on, with the availability of those credits being based on income level or possibly the tax burden that you're paying on the property as a share of your income. This referred to as circuit breaker provisions. And then finally, they also address tax deferrals. And so as far as the current structure of property taxation here, the state law provides currently for property tax deferrals for seniors. It's not available to everyone under certain circumstances. And they are, again, deferrals, which means that the resident can apply to not make payments. However, there's a tally kept of the payments that are not made, and eventually it comes due when the property changes hands. And so that can certainly help someone who is having difficulty making those property tax payments, but doesn't fundamentally alter the structure of the tax. And as for the other recommendations that the Center for American Progress made in this area, I would just say that the authority to proceed with something like that at the city level, or even currently, even at the state level potentially, is not clear.
I just wanted to mention that I believe the King County Assessor has been working with the state legislature and has a bill for homestead exemptions. But you know, we should keep in mind that for every property, and it's a bill I support, I should say, every property tax exemption we create will ultimately reduce revenue to the city. So.
That's a question on that.
Yeah.
So would that mean, if that homestead exemption idea, would that be something that could be tied to a particular levy or something like that? So it wouldn't necessarily, it could just mean that any increases from now on don't impact.
Don't hold me to this, but my recollection of the bill is it is a bill that enables a local jurisdiction to enact such an exemption. It doesn't it doesn't create the exemption in state law. So I think if that is in fact what it does, then the local jurisdiction would have some flexibility. And whether or not the local jurisdiction is the county in this instance or the city, I believe it would probably be the county. So, because the senior exemption program is enacted by the county.
Yeah, and currently, local jurisdictions don't have the authority.
That's right.
To do this, which is
Right.
why the bill is running through
Yeah.
Olympia.
Tony?
I had a question about whether there's different treatment for tax exemptions versus deferrals. Because exemptions, you know, the taxes don't get paid. Deferrals could potentially be recaptured on a sale. So in a sense, you know, we're not losing revenues on a cash flow basis. So that's a question I have, if there's any, you know, legal or distinction in terms of flexibility.
I want to be very careful about dancing around. Again, I'm not your legal counsel, so I don't want to get too far down that road. But there are certain known provisions in state law, including the requirement for a uniform rate and we don't necessarily know how any given policy might end up being implemented or interpreted by the courts. But I would agree with your characterization of the way that a deferral works. It affects the timing of that tax revenue rather than the amount of it.
So, in terms of the specific question, Tony, I'm also not going to endeavor to be your legal counsel today, but I do think that if this task force is interested in making certain recommendations that we know will have a layer of legal questions around it, then what would be helpful for me as a council member is to have those issues identified and connected to whatever the recommendation is. I think that sets us up on the council to be able to, under the attorney-client privilege, to engage with the city attorney's office around those particular legal questions. So, I hope Ashley will make a note of your particular question that I do think will require a response from our city attorney's office should that recommendation move forward by the task force, or a recommendation in this area move forward. So that's what I would suggest in terms of some of these more nitty-gritty questions around legal distinctions or differences. Is we could flag those in the report, and that again gives us as council members and council central staff the opportunity to follow up on those as the council pursues its deliberation of the task force's recommendations. Does that sound okay?
Yes.
Great.
So the next area of tax policy that is addressed in the CAP report is reforms for sales and use taxes. Broadly speaking, the report recommends that if you want to have progressive taxation, that the jurisdiction should reduce or eliminate, if possible, the reliance on sales and use taxes. Now, if you simply reduce the sales tax, obviously that means less revenue. I think in the broader sense, their recommendation is, and then do other things to generate that revenue. But they also make some more specific recommendations for jurisdictions that will be collecting sales and use tax, including exemptions for necessities such as food, medicine. There are some examples given as about articles of clothing below a certain price point. And they also address the idea of providing sales tax credits to households either based on actual or estimated sales tax payments or in fact not. And they specifically address some programs which provide the potential for a refund of sales and use taxes that's not tied to actual tax payments. In terms of the current lay of the land, the city, county, and both the city and the state have a sales and use tax, and the state already exempts not all food, but most non-prepared food, or all non-prepared food, from sales and use tax. I believe there are also a range of medical exemptions. However, the collection or the structure of the sales tax in the state is very, very tightly defined by state law, and the ability, I think, of local governments to make substantial changes in the area of the way that's administered is that's a little hazy. One of those uncertain areas legally. However, the city could reduce its sales and use tax rate. The city collects sales and use tax in two categories. There's a general sales and use tax, that's the largest one. I believe it's 0.85% that the city collects. If that is reduced, obviously the city will, barring any other action taken at the same time, would collect less revenue. It is also possible, because of the way the overall sales and use tax is structured, that if, again, in a vacuum, barring any other developments, if the city were to reduce its general sales tax rate, it may result in those revenues simply being collected by another jurisdiction. And so it may not actually reduce the tax burden overall for residents of the city. The second portion is tied specifically to the Seattle Transportation Benefit District. This was voter approved. It's 0.1%. I think the city could reduce that rate without having that issue of the funds being diverted elsewhere. It would actually reduce the sales tax burden, although it would still raise the issue of reduced revenue for the city. Now, that's specifically tied to transportation uses and was voter approved, so there's some kind of, I think, questions that would potentially raise about the need to potentially direct other funds in that direction, which is not, for the most part, been the purpose of, or been the subject of discussion in this task force, the raising of funds for transportation purposes, but nonetheless, it's there. And the city's authority to do some of the other things that are recommended in the report, like the sales tax credit, it's not clear what the city's authority to go down that road would be. Another area identified in the report is to reduce the reliance on so-called sin taxes. These are just taxes that are levied on a particular product. I think the expression used in the report is disfavored, and I like that because it seems a little less judgmental, but in fact simply points out those items that receive less favorable treatment from the purchaser's standpoint. And so specific taxes that are collected now include, along these lines, include taxes on alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana. The state has levied those taxes. The city recently imposed a sweetened beverage tax, which is also intended to produce both revenue for related purposes, but also to incentivize behaviors that will result in positive health outcomes. And so I would want to note that the CAP report recommends that these be used, these so-called sin taxes be used cautiously because of the regressiveness of the tax itself. However, they do indicate that there may be other policy reasons why a jurisdiction may wish to impose them, understanding that the tax itself is not progressive in nature. The CAP encourages progressive income taxes income tax with higher rates for higher income levels. The city has, in fact, put on the books municipal code, entered into the municipal code a income tax on high earners. However, that is subject to some legal challenges right now, and that's about all I'd say about that right there. But the city has begun to explore down that road. The CAP report also identifies as the opportunity to sell air rights over publicly owned, in this case it would have to be city-owned properties. That's selling the ability to develop higher in other areas. Basically, you would sell like the airspace over a road or a park to a developer, enabling them to build higher in another location. And there I would simply note that starts to enter an area of interaction with land use policy, and so if the task force wishes to recommend something there, that's something that the council and the mayor and the city may wish to kind of consult with some other bodies on in terms of how to coordinate what outcomes would be acceptable or desirable in terms of what is done with the air rights once they're sold.
So there, it sounds like there's sort of like TDRs, transfer
Yes.
development rights,
Yes.
but on public property.
Yes.
Instead of, interesting.
So, can you just give us a little bit, let me know if we're gonna hit your wall on knowledge in this area, and that's fine, but can you give me an example of what that would look like?
I can attempt to describe the concept more than I can give you a specific example of it having been done. But the
That would
idea
be
here
great.
would be, okay, so say there's a park in an area that is broadly zoned for 4 stories of construction. And my understanding of the recommendation made in this report is that if you've got a park that has 0 stories of construction, that you could sell the unused development above that. And they're creating like effectively an easement to preclude development on that site. And then the purchaser of those rights would then, under this kind of a program, would then be able to build higher, say for example, build 8 stories in a 4-story area. I don't know that that's necessarily
different
how it would be
location.
structured. In a different location, not in the park. You're not selling the development of the park itself, but rather the right to build an equivalent or some portion of the equivalent development in an area that is perhaps more appropriate for construction than the park. And then the proceeds, of course, could be used. It's one-time revenue, so it's the sort of thing that would conventionally lend itself to capital investments or that kind of a thing, because it would not be an ongoing revenue stream. That's about the wall that I can provide in terms of my understanding of the concept. And again, this is one of those where there are certain transfer development right programs that are already operating within the state, and I don't know exactly what limitations there are on those. The report also recommends targeted use of tax increment financing. Tax increment financing is it's not a tax per se, but rather it's a model under which, a financing model under which debt is issued, backed effectively by future tax receipts that are tied to development rather than a new tax. And the report really doesn't appear primarily to be pushing for enhanced use of it, but rather for judicious and cautious use of it. It certainly notes that there are potential benefits to this kind of a model, but the CAP recommends that it be used in those cases where the development would not have happened otherwise, rather than simply creating basically a restructuring of the public costs associated with development. And I would say that more research is needed in this area. This is another one that's not as much as the sale of air rights, but begins to kind of get closer to, I think, to planning, land use, development kind of questions. And I'm afraid that's just a bit outside my area of expertise here. But so again, the idea here is that in the report, the gist of it seemed to be that that when using this kind of a model, if a jurisdiction is going to use it, to think about the outcomes and about where the benefits are going to flow, and to whether that flow of benefits is progressive or regressive. The report also also recommends, where possible, the use of a land value tax. This is, generally speaking, I think, a tax that is imposed rather than a property tax and is on the value of land only, rather than land and improvements, as most property taxes and the state's property taxes. So backing that up a little, if you own a piece of land in Washington with a house on it, then your property taxes levy both on the value of the land itself and on the assessed value of the improvement, in this case the building that is on it. A land value tax would be assessed only on the value of land, and so that can mean that that can basically increase the affordability of a tax for a landowner. It can also have an influence on the use of land that land is ultimately put to, and can be used as a tool to encourage certain kinds of development. So again, I don't want to get too far down the road of legal counsel, but this would like at first blush, this would appear to run into the current property tax within the state, which is already assessed on land as well as on improvements. The report also addresses a range of things that kind of broadly fall into fees for service or pricing for publicly provided services or goods. For example, they are in favor of conservation pricing for water and wastewater utilities. They are in favor of tying stormwater drainage fees to factors that are more closely aligned with the actual expected use of drainage rather than, for example, property value or a flat rate. They explore the use of transportation utility fees, things like vehicle miles traveled fees, which are typically going to be tied to transportation, funding transportation-related purposes, and tolls, which also fall into that category. I would note that the city's water rates already have some form of conservation pricing built in. That is to say that the rates vary depending on usage, and that the stormwater fees are also based on impermeable surface area on a property, and that is broadly consistent with their recommendations as is. In the area of vehicle miles traveled fees, I'd say that the city's authority to go down that road is just not clear to me. That would require more research if that was something that the task force is interested in.
Can you say just a little bit more about the concept?
Yeah. So the idea, as I understand it, is basically that if you I'm not exactly sure how it would be administered. I think the easiest way to administer it would be on residents of the city, rather than on trying to keep track of vehicles that have entered the city. And that you would keep track of the mileage on the vehicle and assess a charge based on actual usage. And the idea there is, rather than paying for transportation infrastructure or maintenance on transportation infrastructure via a property tax or a sales tax or something that isn't really tied to the actual use of the infrastructure, the roads and bridges, that instead they recommend that the use of those facilities be the basis for paying for them. And so if someone drives more, then they would pay more. Now, in and of itself, if you have simply one rate per mile for miles traveled, that may or may not end up being progressive. It would very much depend, I think, the outcomes, that is to say, at the individual level, would depend on things like how the person works and what opportunities are available for them for other modes of transportation. But the idea there is, don't charge people who aren't using, but rather treat it like a utility. If you turn on the faucet and run water, you pay for water. If you drive on the road, pay for the road. So moving on to a couple of things that were, I think, raised by the task force and may have been touched on also in the CIP report. One of them is the city estate tax, a tax on the transfer of estates, presumably in excess of some certain value. All I have to say there is that it is not clear to me what statutory authority the city would have to impose something like that. That would definitely be outside of the current structure of tax activity within the state. And another item that was raised was the idea of a tax on cruise ship activity based on passengers boarding these vessels to ride on them and take trips. And it would appear at first blush that that is in conflict with the Federal Rivers and Harbors Appropriation Act, which doesn't necessarily flatly prohibit such taxes, but places some substantial limitations on when they can be collected and what can be done with the revenue. So
the use has to be something related to tourism. Is that?
Or I believe to the harbor itself was my understanding, but this is that area of specific maritime laws. Outside my expertise, I wouldn't want to lead you down the wrong path.
I don't believe it.
Give him a couple hours.
Well, thank you for that really thorough overview of really quite a few different options. Do folks have questions about?
Like Eric just
gave us a bunch of bad news.
So two things. I just want to say, first of all, on the cruise ship thing, since that was my idea, and I don't think that this would necessarily change the fact that there's a conflict, but the idea in my mind was that this would not, that this would be like an excise tax on the purchase of a ticket on a cruise ship, as opposed to a tax on the ship based on, I mean, it would amount to the same thing, but anyway. The other idea that I brought to our meeting on Friday, which isn't on here, is which is something that's a little bit more directly related to the employee hours tax idea, is something that I believe has been done in maybe a couple of other places, but some kind of tax based on excessive compensation, or like if you have a business which is paying its top person or people, some number of times more than the lowest paid person, then they pay some kind of fee or percentage or something like that. Or you could just say, compensation over $500,000 a year, the business pays some kind of fee or percentage above. And you could run into some of the sort of income tax question territory there, but I think that's also worth exploring.
It's the employer who would be paying the tax, not the employee.
That's right.
Other questions, clarifications?
I just want to say thank you for these. Your documents from the last meeting were very helpful in our revenue caucus, so we do really appreciate the time that you are putting into providing us this information that we definitely don't come to this table knowing. It is hugely helpful.
Thank you.
Y'all rock. Thanks. So with that, I think we're moving on to some considerations around use and infrastructure considerations.
So I think the handout that hopefully got
this.
So moving to the first page. Yes, that's correct. This is just picking up a little bit more detail from our last meeting, specifically just to set the table on existing funding. So the 2016 housing levy that was adopted in 2016 provides a 7-year, $290 million property tax levy. What I have detailed here is really the funding streams and programs that actually support either homeless folks or folks under 30% of median income, although the levy can actually support people up to 60% of AMI. So the first program is the rental production and preservation program that can serve households at or below 60% of AMI. $201 million is available over the 7-year period. It is expected that money will generate about 2,150 new units. There is some money in that $201 million to also do some reinvestment of some of our existing city-funded units that are aging and need to have some rehabilitation done to preserve the affordability of those units and extend the affordability of those units. 60% of the rental production money and the operating and maintenance program money have to serve households under 30% of AMI. So that amounts to about $146 million out of that $243 million amount of money. So that's a big policy decision that the council has made over the years to dedicate a significant amount of the levy funding to those most in need, those under 3% of AMI. The operating and maintenance program is the other program that supports households under 30% of AMI, and that allows for $42 million over the 7-year period, with the goal of trying to create 510 new units of operating and services support funding. There's also about $1 million in that $42 million that can be used to extend the subsidy that we now provide to some of those under 30% of AMI units that have been funded from previous levies that, believe it or not, are actually coming to the end of their 20-year period. And so we are going to begin to need to provide some extension of those subsidies. And so there's a little bit in this levy to begin to fund those units. There is also a small slice of money in the housing levy for home ownership, about $9.5 million over the 7-year period. The bulk of that will serve people at or under 80% of AMI. There is a new pilot that we are doing, a 2-year pilot that actually is targeted specifically for folks who are at risk of foreclosure. It's about a $484,000 commitment over a 2-year period. I believe Homestead is the one who will be implementing that program. And I would suggest to you that program, that homeownership program, gets at the target of those who might be at risk of homelessness if they don't have some of that assistance.
So,
questions?
Excuse me.
No questions?
So moving on to emergency services shelter. So before I discuss this slide, just to provide further context, so the Use Caucus asked to narrow down on specific interventions. So just as a reminder from last meeting, we outlined very broadly the interventions. So there's rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, outreach, emergency services, which encompasses shelter, authorized encampments, day services, and then also transitional, oh, did I mention transitional housing? Yeah, okay, excuse me, and transitional housing. So, so today I'm focusing in on several interventions that the Use Caucus requested, including a discussion of shelter and specifically the RFP process and how those results were made. So I'm going to provide just a broad overview specifically for shelter and the RFP. So in 2017, the RFP for homelessness services, which competed $30 million, there were 50 applications for emergency services. So emergency services, again, shelter, day shelters, authorized encampment services, those services for people who are literally homeless and are awaiting a permanent housing solution. So of those 50 applications, 27 were recommended to move forward, totaling about almost $15 million. So how were those selected? So the criteria in the RFP aligns with the Pathways Home strategy that the executive started in 2016. And so criteria include primarily a focus for shelter, a focus on the enhanced shelter model. So enhanced shelter means providing overnight shelter with also perhaps extended hours, so 24/7 shelter, for example, with more intensive case management services, allowing couples to be in the same shelter, storing possessions, allowing pets. So the reason for this change is because they found that enhanced shelter has a lower exit to permanent housing rate. So also that people who are on the street and are chronically homeless are more likely to accept an offer of shelter if the space is an enhanced shelter bed. Oh, and an important thing is enhanced shelter can also mean low barrier, meaning there may not be necessarily a sobriety requirement to participate in that shelter.
Alan, can I
yes.
just I think it's important to comment that the exit to permanent housing is not about the shelter, it's about the people, right, and the barriers that they face. There's nothing about enhanced shelter that makes it harder to leave, but the people for whom that's a good fit find it harder to be placed
Absolutely.
in housing.
Yeah, thank you for that nuance. Very important nuance. So that's one of the primary criterion, but other criteria include performance data, so looking at historic performance data on how a given provider exits people to permanent housing, also a bunch of considerations, and then a race and social justice focus. So at the last presentation, I noted that African Americans, Native Americans, Alaska Natives have a higher disproportionate rate to be homeless, and so the focus of the RFP were on those populations. So those did result in new providers. I think there were 3 or 4 new providers receiving funding for emergency services. But there were a number of providers who received funding in the past that did not receive funding in this RFP. To address some of that, the executive did provide some bridge funding. So the executive provided about $1 million in bridge funding for organizations with whom the city currently has a contract to provide up to approximately 6 months of funding. So of that $1 million, about $850,000 was given to shelter services. So the vast majority of that bridge funding for the next 6 months was given to to shelter services that were not selected in the RFP. Yes.
You know, under your last bullet where you say 27 projects recommended, 20.5 thousand households served, that's a target, right? You
That's a
haven't
projected.
Yeah,
That's projected.
so you haven't served, you're hoping to serve.
Yeah, so if you add the word projected in there, that's correct. So they project 20,500 households served in 2018, and they project of that 2,000 households will exit to permanent housing.
And, Alan, am I correct on the number that currently that 1 million bridge funding for those 6 months is keeping about 300 shelter beds in place?
Yes, that's my understanding as well. So the cost rates.
Alan, before you move on from
Yeah.
that, there's 20.5 projected households to be served, of which it's projected that only 2,000 of those households will be transitioned to permanent housing. How was that 2,000? Do we know how we came to that 2,000 number?
I believe it's based, actually no. So I don't know
Okay.
the exact calculations, but I can request that.
Is it based on, it's 10%, so is it based on a performance target of 10%?
Yeah, so each application had to indicate as to whether or not they could meet the performance data, but that's also, it's not just that, I believe it's also combined with historic H-minus data, and they calculate that out. So I think it's a multifaceted calculation.
So it's both a combination of the performance targets and what has actually happened on the ground in the past.
Yes. But I can get the exact calculations for that. Yes?
So the number for like cost per bed for basic shelter beds is $5,597, but from Share Wheels perspectives, it costs us about $5 a night per shelter bed, so it's about $2,000 a year per shelter bed. So that's, you know, more than half, it's less than half of that.
Right, so I believe, so this came from the executive, these rates, the cost per bed for a basic shelter, that's typically mat on the floor shelter, and that's not to denigrate basic shelter. And then the enhanced shelter is what I described at 14,873. So I believe that those numbers come from what is being funded by the RFP as opposed to what is not being funded by the RFP.
And a consideration there could be the overall dollar amounts, which could cover staffing and other costs above and beyond what might be considered service costs, if that makes sense. I would assume.
Yes, and there's also a range too. So each of these numbers are either a median or an average based on what the actual data is. So.
Other questions?
What happens after 6 months to the service providers and to their clients? But
From the $1 million bridge funding?
So about 850,000 were meant for shelters. So with this RFP and the shift of the service to enhanced shelter, it is the expectation of the executive that they will actually increase the number of exits to permanent housing. So so inevitably there's going to be some shifting going on. The other remaining 150,000 of that $1 million bridge funding are targeted for programs like transitional housing programs, and that is meant to sustain them as they transition those clients to other transitional housing or other similar services.
So the hope is that those 300 beds will be actually in some sort of transition mode at the end of the 6 months?
Yes.
Well, you mean that the people who are on those beds will have transition?
And I'm sorry,
the beds won't continue, right?
I'm sorry, so I talked about two things just now. I talked about shelter, and then I also talked about transitional housing, so those are two separate things. So the hope is that the higher utility rate of the enhanced shelter will address the need caused by closing the shelter beds. So the number of actual enhanced beds, the stock of that will have increased by several hundred. Also, the number of 24/7 beds will have increased substantially, and then the ratio of basic shelter beds to Enhanced beds will go to something like 87% to 13%.
So there's a plan to continue pumping money into these programs, only somewhat different application of those.
There's increased money, and there is a different mix of how that money is
Different mix.
distributed.
This isn't rapid rehousing, is it?
No, this is emergency services. This is shelter. Yes. Rapid rehousing is a housing solution. This is emergency shelter. This is no housing. Lisa? Oh.
Dan, Lisa, Katie.
I just want to make sure I'm catching all this right. I think you're talking some about, for the theory of change, about how the system will be accommodating people, but in answer to Tom's question, the beds that are being funded with bridge funding now will literally cease to operate.
That is correct.
When the bridge funding goes away.
That is correct.
I don't want you to hear this as a person, like I realize this is really a question for HSD via council staff, but what, if any, cautions or counterbalancing is going on in evaluating the performance of the providers that were awarded contracts to ensure that they don't meet their exits to housing targets by serving only those who are easiest to place in housing? In other words, deprioritizing people with highest barriers. How are we ensuring that that is not the predictable outcome of this way of evaluating performance?
That's a great question. I think there are multiple strains to answer that question. As I said before, the enhanced shelter model itself also entails lowering barriers, so removing sobriety requirements.
But that's to get in.
Yes.
That's to get into these facilities, not to get out.
Oh, so you're talking about
This is-
performance, about...
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good question. I can ask. I know it's been asked before.
And Katie, and then I'm going to ask if folks could write down other questions. We'll have sort of a roundup, but I want to make sure we move through all the content here. Katie.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask for a clarification on the 27 projects recommended, it looks like, so about 10% of the households served are projected to move into permanent housing. How does that relate to the sort of target of the RFP, which I understand was something like 40%? And so that's a question. And then secondly, I just wanted to add to what Courtney was saying about like shares cost per bed. And I think in their case, they're probably on the very low end of the cost scale, partly because they do this partnership with churches, so that a lot of the costs are actually being absorbed by church partners.
Other institutions, right. That's a really good point.
Question.
Seems like a good model.
The 10% performance metric, is that projections or is that based on past performance?
I believe it's a combination, but I'll see clarity on that.
All right, let's move on to transitional housing considerations.
Seems low.
Just before you do that.
Yes,
yeah, I mean, I sort of started poking around this 2,000 of 20.5 thousand because 10% seems low to me. And so I think it would be worth having a little bit more information just to understand how the city arrived at the 2,000 number, if you don't know that off the top of your head now. I just think it would be helpful to understand why it's only 10%.
You know what, actually, I think, come to think of it, I think it's because the 20,500 may be households served by emergency services overall. And so, not just shelter, so that would also include day centers and other services. So I'll get a refined number on.
On shelter use specifically as a subset of that larger number.
Yes.
Okay.
Is the math based on new clients or reoccurring clients?
I'm not sure, so I will get a refined calculation. Yeah.
And then just, I guess relating to that, one of the things that you said is that this question around the presumption of a higher utility rate for the enhanced shelter models, that is, I guess, the underlying assumption as to why bridge funding isn't needed beyond 6 months. How do we know how the human services department and the executive as a whole is evaluating the higher utility rate between now and the end of the 6 months that would support that underlying assumption.
Well, I know that the underlying assumption is also supported by several major studies that were done several years ago, including the Focus Strategies report and the Barb Poppy report that looked at historic data and saw that there was a higher utilization rate for, in other jurisdictions, for enhanced shelter versus basic shelter. So the primary tool that they use to track homelessness and whether people re-enter into homelessness is HMIS. They are making refinements to HMIS. HMIS is not perfect, and they're constantly tweaking it. But I believe that's the primary tool that they use to evaluate and assess whether or not someone is accessing services.
Right. I guess.
And so
so are they doing that right now to evaluate whether the studies are matching up with reality of what we're seeing in our community? I mean, one of the things that Barb Poppy's report also said is that we should no longer do sanctioned encampments, period. But we've actually seen that for Seattle, doing sanctioned encampments has actually been successful in terms of connecting people to services and permanent housing. So I want to make sure that I get the studies, and I think it's important for us to look at the studies and the literature, and and have that in mind. But I think we also have to be cognizant of the fact that sometimes the studies don't play out the way that we had hoped they would in our city, and so I just want to make sure that the executive and that we have a good sense of how the executive is evaluating whether or not the higher utility rate in Seattle is consistent with what the reporting was and what the projections have been. So sort of what are those real numbers, and how are we evaluating those real numbers to be able to determine whether or not at the end of the 6 months we're going to end up in a situation where we actually see and have more people sleeping outside as a result of the direction of this RFP.
Yeah.
So
And
you may
my
not have the answer to that right now, but I think it's important for us as we're having this conversation to get a better understanding of whether that's a system failure that we can address here.
And to piggyback on that, I guess my question too, because what that report did not talk about, which was an unknown to the consultant, right, is how long it'll take for the time of those transitions, which will have some impacts, I think, on how many rounds of bridge funding you need until the other systems are set up. So to your point, I think we need a bigger context of that if we're going to have recommendations in this report.
Yeah, and I think some of the recommendations in this report, as it relates to defining the need, I think this is relevant to that conversation around the realities of how the need is going to grow, either unintentionally or otherwise as a result of some of the decisions we've made about how we're structuring investments in this area.
The executive has made a pretty bold statement about the increase in the number of access to permanent housing and utilization rates, so we can certainly ask for specifics.
This executive or the other ones?
That's a great point, excuse me.
Yeah.
So Mayor Murray and also Mayor Burgess. Yeah, excellent point.
Councilmember Herbal.
Thank you.
Courtney had her hand up.
I'm sorry, Courtney. Councilmember Herbal and then Courtney. So I apologize.
Thanks. That's all right. So just back on the question around this rather low-seeming 10% on exits to permanent housing, I think it would be useful to have it broken out according to type of intervention, but I believe those other interventions are also evaluated on their success in having exits to permanent housing.
That
So
is
day
correct.
centers
Yeah, that is correct.
and referral centers. So if broken out, I might anticipate it still being 10%, yeah, right across, or some mix that would average out as 10%. So drilling down more on that, it would be great, but I don't know if it's going to tell us something hugely different, but I would still like to know if it's 10%.
Still good to
Yeah,
know.
and then the other piece too, as we're talking about bridge funding and recommendations that might come out of this group, one of the questions that I've asked HSD is, I think bridge funding might be better defined as more transition funding, because the funding is being used to continue to provide the services for a period of time. For me, a bridge would be a plan not just to provide the services for a period of time, but to ensure the people receiving the services are actually transitioning to spaces that are held for them in these new models. We know that the need is great, and as we're bringing on new either enhanced shelter or other interventions, that we're expecting to offer more capacity. If the current system of referral is going to be a first come, first serve in the coordinated entry system, how are the people who are currently served, for instance, in the share wheel shelters, going to get from where they are now to where the city is saying there's additional capacity? And there doesn't seem to be a plan to engage on the person level to get folks from one place to the other. Yeah, that's the question I've been asking.
Courtney, and then Tony, and then we really are transitioning to transitional housing.
All I wanted to say was, when the RFP happened, HSD said that we Share didn't place anybody. Well, Lehigh, great case management. Out of the 77 people that worked with Lehigh, 25 of them got housing, and one of them is sitting right here, and now he's working for Share. So that's a success story. So, we really need these basic mats on the floor shelters because they are successful.
And you're talking about a 33% success rate. So thank you for that. And
Yeah,
Tony?
my question is kind of related to Ian's question. He asked about recurring versus new. Do we have any information on the rate of entry into emergency services of new people?
Yes.
Because I'm trying to see the other end of the 2,000 permanent transition. If we're not getting the same rate of increase, if less than 2,000 people enter the system every year, and we're moving 2,000 people out.
Are we actually getting ahead of the problem?
Yes,
or only
yes,
keeping
yes.
pace?
But we do know that we are not.
Yeah.
We know
Thank
that
you.
simply that the exits from the housing are far dwarfed, have been far dwarfed by people requiring services.
Well, but also because we don't have housing.
Right.
We don't have, and that sort of gets us to the revenue side is that we just, and Councilmember Herbold sent out a memo from our Office of Housing yesterday in response to one of the slides that was passed during this last budget cycle that highlights the complexities around and the realities around the fact that that we simply don't have enough resources to be able to build the amount of housing to meet the reality of the need that is demonstrated by what we see on the streets every day. And so, we're talking a lot about the emergency services shelter spectrum of the question, and that the exits are important because that's where we want to eventually be. The problem is we don't have capacity in terms of where to send all of the folks who we are asking to engage with our shelter system, but yet don't actually have a meaningful throughput to place folks.
Point well taken, Councilmember Gonzalez, and I see your hands. I'm going to write them down. I'm going to add them to the next thing because to that point, this is building to that path to talking through the permanent housing solutions. And part of what this body needs is all of this information, because what we need to think through is what is our recommendation for any revenue solution we come up with about what's going where and at what percentage compared to other services. So we really need to get through this content for us to really mull that over. So with that, I saw Lisa and Ian's hand. I'm going to add it to the list, and we're going to move on to transitional housing, please.
Don't forget what you're going to say.
I already sent an email, but.
So, transitional housing. So for the RFP, there were, excuse me, 20 projects, that says recommended, but it actually should say applicant. The 20 projects applied at about $7.5 million, and of that, 7 projects were awarded almost $2 million, $1.9 million, which amounts to 310 beds. Again, 20,500 households served, and 2,000 households transitioned to permanent housing. Actually,
It's the
that
same
cannot
number.
be correct.
That just can't
That
be.
can't
Same
be correct.
number.
I apologize for that. But the cost per unit of transitional housing, that is about $6,000.
There's 20,000 people in those 310 beds.
Yeah, that's a lot of people. Yes. Oh, yes, and this, just to clarify, this,
Willy Wonka. Remember the grandpa and grandma?
this doesn't include any capital dollars.
Say it again?
This doesn't include capital. This is purely services.
Okay, and then to give folks a context with transitional housing, approximately how long is it assumed someone will have access to this housing before they could move into permanent housing solution, and what's the determinations on that?
So usually transitional housing, the model is about 2 years, but we know that the average in the King County area is a little bit longer than that. So.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So transitional housing, as you're talking about it, is an existing building and there is a unit in the building that is considered transitional that wouldn't designate it from any other unit in that apartment building, right? And so the $6,000 is the cost to service the unit?
Yes.
The household, whether it's 1 person or 5 people in the unit?
I believe
Or
it's
is it-
actually per room within if there are multiple rooms in, so I believe a unit is considered to be client-centered. So 1 unit, 1 client, $6,000. So whether that's a model that utilizes 1 space with multiple rooms with multiple clients, so I believe that is $6,000 per unit. It's rent, it's also the intensive case management services provided to that person. So the transitional housing model is designed for, usually for people who, for example, don't qualify for permanent supportive housing. Their needs aren't as high to qualify for permanent supportive housing, so they're placed in transitional housing, and the idea is that they're placed there, they're given services, intensive case management to prep them to move on to permanent housing.
That 6,000, is that for a year? It's for a person
for a year. For a year.
Are these city-owned properties? Can you give an example of what a transitional housing building is?
In general, I don't think that they are not city-owned. So they're not. Yeah.
They're nonprofit. They're not.
Tom, you can speak to some of the Lehigh properties.
YWCA Family Village, long-term transitional housing.
Lehigh has some as well.
And there are, I believe there are some transitional housing programs where they're all in, say, 1 house or 1 building, and then there's, as Michael said, there's the scattered site model.
Well,
where
I was
they're
thinking
placed.
more like, we manage some apartment buildings, and out of the 50 units, there's 5 that are transitional housing units.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or there could be an apartment building with 1 unit that has transitional housing in it. That's where the person's receiving services from an organization.
And to clarify, when you're saying that counseling and other services are provided, the idea is that you're transitioning them out of homelessness and giving them all the circumstances that once they're moved into permanent housing, they should have the skills and resource capacity to stay in that permanent housing, correct?
Correct.
Other questions?
Do you want to speak a little bit to why the city is moving away, with the exception of a couple of particular demographic groups, the city's moving away from transitional housing?
Yeah, so the reports that I alluded to before, the focus strategies report and the Poppy report found that the cost per exit to permanent housing for transitional housing is inordinately high, and it's because for some populations the length of stay is quite long. And compared to an intervention, somewhat similar intervention, rapid rehousing, the cost is much higher. And so with Pathways, you see a transition away from transitional housing. So there are there hasn't been a decrease in the actual dollar amount invested in transitional housing. It's remained flat. So the city is investing more of those dollars into the other interventions, particularly rapid rehousing.
In that assumption of changing the full model, was there consideration about both what permanent housing solutions are available on the other end? Because if you're talking about the usual stay on average goal being 2 years, but that folks have longer stays, were the longer stays about not having permanent spots for permanent placement, or was it that their needs exceeded? Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
Is it the service provision side or the inventory shortage side that is causing the longer stays, which would increase costs?
The examples that were provided in the report seem to indicate a service provider choice in that matter. So, which is sort of a theme with a number of interventions. So, for example, shelter. We find that with some providers, there were clients who were in shelter for literally years. That's not maybe the best use for shelter, but in those, if I can talk anecdotally, in those cases, I could see why a provider, seeing someone staying in the shelter for years, they are, contributing to that community. They are, it seems to be going down on an individual level, but that isn't what the city intends to pay for with those funds. So I believe it's a similar type of situation.
I don't think that's an accurate reflection of the provider perspective about people who are in shelter
Of course,
long term.
yeah.
I think the perspective is we've got this person that we're keeping safe, but we've been unsuccessful at working with that person to move out.
Sure.
Sometimes due to really deep-seated issues that the individual has in terms of cooperating with the process to move out and all that.
Thank you for that nuance. And one of the strategies that was initiated under Pathways is this long-term shelter stayers work group, and I believe they meet, if not weekly, I think it's monthly or something, and they focus on a by name list for people who have been in shelter for a long time, and they find that some of these people who have been in shelter for a long time, some of them actually have a housing voucher, and they've had it for a long time. So the strategy then is to get them to exercise those resources and to move them out to make that shelter space available.
Katie, Lisa, do you want to get in on the mix, Ian, since you missed the last one? Okay, great. Katie and Lisa.
Moment is fast.
So I'm just thinking, as we're talking about, in the case of shelter, the trade-offs between enhanced shelter and more basic shelter, and here with transitional housing versus rapid rehousing. And I'm wondering that as the city sort of decided on these priorities, whether there was thought about the fact that homeless people aren't all the same person, and that there's a variety of needs and ability and et cetera, so that for instance, it might be that for the section of the homeless population that can succeed with rapid rehousing and be able to pay their own rent within 3 to 9 months, yes, that is a cheaper way to do it than transitional housing, but perhaps 70% of the homeless population is not going to succeed that way. And similarly with the shelter question, perhaps 30% of the homeless population really needs that low barrier enhanced shelter in order to succeed, but maybe the rest don't, and maybe that ends up being a very expensive way to shelter. We don't need that if we have limited resources. So I'm just wondering if that conversation happened before it was decided to shift all the resources in this manner.
I could say that as it relates to transitional housing, as I alluded to before, HSD has conceded the point that for, or conceded might not be the right word, has agreed that for youth and immigrant families, transitional housing remains the most effective intervention, more so than rapid rehousing. But that is a sort of a demographic determination as opposed to a sort of one that is just based on, sort of regardless of demographic, there are, as you say, all homeless people are not
circumstances
the same. Yeah.
But point well taken that we should keep in mind that we don't have to have a conversation where one is versus the other, but can have a context of yes and in our recommendations if we feel that's the best recommendation. Lisa.
I just wanted to comment on the long-term shelter stay or by name list, that while an understandable response to people getting stuck in the shelter system, not being able to find or be placed in permanent housing, it also has had the effect of further deprioritizing people who don't fit in the shelter system itself. And so that has been a kind of a queue skipping device to further elevate people who fit better than other people do in the existing shelter system. So it sounds good within the column that it addresses, but it has system effects as well that may be contrary to our mission as the task force.
All right, let's move on to permanent supportive housing.
Okay, so this is really just to kind of lay out for you, based on the most current information we have about costs, what creation of permanent supportive housing might look like, should that be a desired intervention that a person wants to consider. So just to be really clear, permanent supportive housing projects are projects that include an array of services to help those who have a series of issues, from mental health issues to perhaps addiction issues, and perhaps other things as well, health conditions as well. So fully loaded with services, 24/7 front desk usually, usually for those who are the most vulnerable on the streets. So based on the most recent NOFA that we did, the capital cost per unit, you'll hear this a couple of times this afternoon, $312,000 a unit, average cost. For doing any new or additional permanent supportive housing units beyond what the levy is planning to do, which we just talked about earlier, the city would have to cover that entire cost of that unit. And that is because the levy is presuming that we are tapping into all the other usual leverage sources: housing trust fund, low-income housing tax credit, the county, all the other typical providers. So we would be going it alone on the price of the capital cost of the unit. So if you were going to do 180, 100 unit building, you'd be looking at $25 million to $31 million for just the capital side of the equation. You also then have to cover the services cost. And what we know that cost to be, on average, again, $17,000 per unit per year. And typically the city makes a 20-year commitment. Heard earlier that we've got some units that we've funded, many units that we funded from prior levies. We anticipate to do more of those. And they are 20-year commitments, and I would say that they are actually 20 years plus, because we don't anticipate ever wanting to stop providing that subsidy once we support those units. Again, levy sources in this area in particular, very limited. Housing levy is absolutely counting on those existing resources. So again, we would be covering the full cost on an annual basis of about $1.3 to $1.7 million for an 80 to 100 unit building. You have to anticipate that those costs are going to go up a year, and I think we actually have calculated, the city has calculated about 4% inflation factor. So that's, the base is 1.3 to 1.7 a year, but it needs to be inflated over 4% a year over that 20-year period. So we just understand that that's kind of the long-term cost there.
I know there are a lot of other experts in the room, but I'm a little shocked that it's $312,000 to build a single unit. That seems extraordinarily high, especially when you're talking about potential multi-unit build. I'm assuming we're not talking about elaborate single-family homes.
No,
that
we're talking about an 80 to 100 unit building.
Right. I feel like that number is really, really large, but other folks
Dan,
who build
Michael, you guys
things
want to
help me
weigh
wrap
in on
my
this?
mind
I looked at the
around
numbers
it.
again today, and I'm telling you that's the average.
Yeah.
And I'm just telling you.
I know you're just the messenger. I'm just.
Yeah. Sorry.
But for folks who find themselves, should I not be shocked by that number?
You should be.
Okay.
You should be. It's true, but it seems low, but
it's
don't.
It's an accurate number, but you should be shocked.
Okay.
I've been doing this for 40 years, and I'm shocked.
Okay.
And that's not a family unit.
No.
And this includes the dirt too, right?
That includes everything.
It actually includes.
It includes dirt?
No, of course, it includes all costs, land costs and construction
Okay,
costs.
so it's land acquisition,
Yeah, it's the
building,
full
it's the
cost to
whole
develop.
But it doesn't
Finance,
include the services.
No, it doesn't. It's just the capital cost, the hard cost of
Prevailing
it.
wages, net carry, until you get to wherever.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm reading reports in Utah, they're building units for about $12,000 a piece in the state of Utah, so.
It's a right to
it's
work
probably a
state,
lot
and there are
cheaper,
no
but very
prevailing
different.
wages.
Yeah, okay, there you go, all right.
Utah's a different place.
There you go.
Okay, well, there's an option.
You
Just
I'll move to
kidding, just
Utah.
kidding.
Other questions, comments? Katie?
So you explained this very clearly, so you're probably just going to say, yes, that's right. But I was actually under the impression that although the city wouldn't be able to leverage as much other funding as we can for the units that are currently planned, there at least would be some, so that the city would not be covering the entire $312,000 cost of each unit. But that's just wrong.
Not for permanent supportive housing units. For people,
okay.
We will talk about a little bit later about another type of project that we could do that actually we could tap into some leverage.
So, and that's just because, just because of the specific revenue streams that are available to match for permanent support.
And that we have done our calculation in terms of getting to that 2,150 unit goal for the housing levy. We have presumed tapping into all those resources.
So of the 2,150 units anticipated to be created, how many of them will be permanent supportive housing? So this is in addition to how many that are to be created?
So I think the goal, and this is like really ballpark, based on a lot of assumptions, is that maybe 1,250 could be the under 30%, and the under 30% that might be permanent supportive housing units, I can't tell you, because of the uncertainty around McKinney, ORS, some of the other fund sources that there's great uncertainty right now.
But there is anticipation that some will
Oh,
be
absolutely,
created
absolutely.
before this kind of thing would come into play.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
So I'm gonna do a time check here and ask something of the group here. So the other two pieces here are extensions around prevention and mixed income building units. What I'm wondering is, with consideration that we knew the context of this conversation was going to carry over to meeting 4, if it would be okay, aren't you facilitating the next meeting? To maybe move those two contexts to the next, for briefings in the next meeting, potentially, and so that we can dig into some other activities and conversations based on what we have now.
I'm not going to be in town for the
Oh,
last one.
for the last
building.
one?
I could do the mixed income building, which actually plays off of really well. Of the
Is that
information.
okay?
Yeah,
And then we
that
can
would be
move
great.
the prevention context to the next meeting? Let's do
and
that.
potential uses. That's okay.
That'd be wonderful.
So
And
let's-
so I'm gonna ask folks to hold questions on this piece, since it's an extension of the permanent housing conversation we just had, so we can fold into the other activity, because we're running short on time, and I wanna make sure we have some time to have some broader conversation.
So let's
Thank you,
move quickly
Tracy.
to slide number 6. So this is an alternative to the permanent supportive housing unit project. This would be a mixed income building that would serve households at or below 30% of median income, and also 60% of annual median income. This kind of project would obviously be targeted for those 22,000 households that we talked about last time that are severely rent cost burdened, who might be at risk of homelessness. So it is for folks who are at a higher level of functioning, but may still themselves be at risk of homelessness because of unaffordable housing. So again, capital cost, total capital cost of the unit doesn't change, $312,000 per unit. What does change is the ability for the city to tap into the 4% tax credit program, and there is that available resource. What that does for us on the capital side is it reduces the capital cost for the city to about $170,000 per unit, or about, yeah, I know, it's pretty good, doesn't it? Oh, what a bargain. Or about $17 million if you're gonna do 100-unit building. The building would include 30 units of those, for serving those under 30% of median income, about 70 units for those under 60% of median income, and I'll explain in a minute why that's important. Again, this housing would serve people at those income levels. There would not be any services or operating support provided by the city with this type of project. We would expect that the rents paid by those at 30%, and in particular the 60%, would cover the operating costs, and also would be able to cover likely some debt that would have to be attached to that project. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. I feel like every meeting we learn so much. But what we're going to do now is sort of get in the mode of what it's going to be as a body to start making some decisions together.
Before we move on, can I just
Yes.
ask that everybody look at the last page?
Yes.
We don't have to talk about it, but page 7, I think maybe just if people just take a minute to either look at it now or look at it later, I think gives us a little bit of an idea of what we could do according to scale for the different interventions.
And just a word about this, the $10 million, the expectation is that $10 million would be ongoing annual allocations, because you will see on this chart some things that say just one time, just like we talked about some of the capital costs, but the ones that don't have the one time attached to them are actually ongoing annual contributions that would have to be made towards that intervention. So just wanted to make sure that you understood that.
Thank you, I appreciate it, Ms. Number
Yeah, so this might be helpful actually in the next context, in the next conversation, and I just want to review what I think this is so you can tell me if I'm wrong. Tracy. So what this is, and what I sort of asked central staff, is to give us just something to respond to as a scenario, right, of what it looks like with all the information we've gathered through now 3 meetings, of all the options of where need is. And again, the use caucus has narrowed down significantly. There's still a whole host of things that need funding and services, but we've tried to narrow it down to the context of this group and our priorities. And so this is just a sample scenario of how $10 million, again, on a revenue source that's renewed annually, could be distributed potentially, and what the costs and service end of people impacted or helped on the other end looks like. So again, this is just an example. This is not a recommendation, but it's something for folks to sort of get a sense of the kind of depth and conversation we can have as we're making our recommendations. Did I get that right?
You did, and
okay.
To be clear, you'd have to choose one of these things. Obviously, you could do the math and figure out, oh, you can't do all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
This is just kind of if you had $10 million, what would it buy you in the way of prevention? What would it buy you in the way of basic shelter? What would it buy in the way of transitional housing?
Mm-hmm.
You pick one. Not all of these could be done for $10 million.
So for 10 million, or pieces of each of them, right? A reduction on any one in a combination.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the question I have is whether the mixed income housing is an actual option, because if you're assuming all the other sources are leveraged, it doesn't seem like the mixed income housing is actually an option. I mean, it helps to sort of compare because there's only so much tax credits, 4% tax credits.
That's I shouldn't say it's unlimited, but there has been less constraint on that.
Okay,
as an
okay.
option,
No,
yeah.
that's good to know.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we are counting for the fact that there could be additional tax
Yes,
credits and
absolutely.
tax exempt bonds.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, is it burning or can it wait for the small group work?
Well, it's about that. What they're
Okay.
just talking about.
All right,
I'll make it
if
quick.
it's quick.
So I just wanted to register. So if the idea is that this mixed income building would pay for itself operations wise once it was built, I mean, in principle, you could do a mixed income building that also included some higher income units, even up to market rate units, that would actually create a revenue stream that could potentially support, permanent supportive housing or something elsewhere, or something, or permanent supportive housing in that building or something like that. So I'm just wondering, maybe this is a bigger question for later, but are there problems with how the money stuff works that make that difficult to do?
So Daniel, you're going to chime in on this, I'm sure. So we don't typically try to have permanent supportive housing units along with like up to market rate units, just because there are very different populations. No offense, just recognizing that there might be some conflict there. So I don't think I have seen a typical project where you mix permanent supportive housing. You can certainly mix under 30%. And 60 and 80, I think we've done some of those. We're trying to do more of those, but I don't think you could put permanent supportive housing in like a 80%.
The bigger point is just if you included some higher income units, then you would have revenue somewhere to put into stuff, so that we're not just pulling from tax revenue.
In theory.
Sorry.
Yeah.
This is so in the weeds, but yes, I get what you're talking about. Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. So with this, what I'm going to ask is for folks to break into some small groups and really reflect on 2 core questions in your small group over the next 10 minutes. And we don't have time for a report out. After that 10 minutes, we're going to go straight into public comment. But it's really to get this process started with what it's going to look like for us to make some decisions together. So if folks could raise your hand, for folks that are on 2 caucuses, I'm going to ask you to not raise your hand until we see what the ratio of people on either of the other caucus representations look like, because I want to do some mixed caucus conversations here. So who's currently serving on the revenue generating caucus?
I guess I am too.
8. Okay, and then who's working on the revenue use caucus?
Oh, that's me. I'm sorry.
1,
Yeah, I know.
5. Okay, so, and who's on both caucuses? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so for the folks on both caucuses, if you could wear your revenue use hat for this activity. And so what I'm going to ask folks is to match up again. So revenue generating caucus, raise your hand right now. And then match yourself up with someone whose hand is not raised right now and reflect on one of these two questions. What is your current stance on the question of generating 25 million to 75 million a year in either employee hours tax, progressive revenue, or other proposed options discussed today? Or you can reflect together on the question, what other information do you feel you need to make key decisions? So we're moving into decision-making mode in the next few meetings on both the raising revenue question and use funds, because we've gotten a lot of information at this point. We could do a process where all we're doing is getting information for the rest of our lives, but we can't do that. We have to make decisions as a body.
In the interest of time, would it make sense to maybe just do that in one group?
In the interest of time, I think people need to start having conversations, and if we do it in one group, we're not going to make it around the table in 10 minutes.
Okay, all right.
Is my concern, which is why I wanted people to do it in pairs to start reflection.
Okay.
These two questions wrapped up.
So do we keep track of what we say and then bring it to the next meeting?
That would be wonderful.
To the next meeting.
Yes.
Can we email it to you in advance of the next meeting? Because I'm not going to remember.
Okay.
Is that an option?
Sure.
Just so that people can
Yeah.
start collecting it
Yeah.
and figuring out if there's more information needed.
How about this? Everyone sit down, someone have a piece of paper, write down what you discussed, give the paper to me, and I will work with folks to reconcile it for consideration at the next meeting. And this is just a dosed conversation, your personal reflection at this point in the process, one of these two considerations. What are your thoughts on where you're at, and can you make decisions? And if you're like, I can't because I need a certain piece of information, talk about what that is, write it down together, hand it back to me. Does that work for folks?
Yep.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Sure.
So partner up. Again, if you're doing revenue generating, raise your hand.
Number 1.
Match up with somebody. Sure. That's great. I wish we did have time. I know, 30 minutes for that. Do just that.
Yeah, I just thought there was two short questions. I thought we could go around and everybody can say what they
My sense is that it's going to be so place that
Right.
people writing it down.
Okay.
Get a reflection.
So, question 1, that was the target that the resolution says.
Yeah.
I'm fine with it. I'm feeling good about that target.
Great.
And as far as other information, on both the raising of the revenue and the use, I think this is incredibly useful.
Yeah, it is.
And I think we need more work done around the options available to us for a structure of an employee hours tax. So what the different options would look like with different exemptions. Well, I think there's been some preliminary work done that central staff has done, but I think we need to do sort of the next iteration. The last meeting here, big meeting, they did a back of the envelope. This is what we could produce under these different tax structures. But since that time, there have been more questions around exemptions, structure, and so I think we need to take that next cut and have another document from central staff, and then we match that to this.
Yeah, and my notes were that that's a lot of the depth next meeting. That there's going to be a little bit of time on this use question. Mostly it's going to be, which is why Tony and I split it up the way we did. So
Why we have
yeah, I mean, I feel good with that threshold. I mean, everything in me is saying to even begin to get any of this at scale, we're going to be talking about hopefully a $75 million plus solution. Because scaling any of this, and if we decide as a group to take, I mean, we could decide to put it all into permanent housing. I think we could decide it's a combination that's needed, especially when I think of what's happening on the shelter end. Whatever this body comes up with, I mean, taking this times 7 gets you at least to some bit of scale.
The only other thing I can think of that would be useful as it relates to this is to figure out what the unmet need is for each of these
categories. So you know how much traction you're getting in an 8. That's a really good point.
And so if we want to, if we want to do a combination of interventions, I think it would be useful to make recommendations about what percentages for each of the
I'm glad you Councilmember Gonzalez dug into I'm wondering how much of that number was about an understanding of the shortage of inventory, not second expectation, right? You're going to set up
Well, they want specifics on the employee hours. None of those.
If you have versus we've actually met the need. It can sometimes be 2 different things. So it's a bigger, and I know that's a bigger consideration than this group is doing, but I know you as a body have bigger considerations there.
For the oversight, right? If we engineer this shift based on this report that is based on a study of other cities that are not our own, right? We have to now look at like the reality. And for me, the reality was completely different than what the reality in the report. We've done a shift based on that.
And the reason I was like, I need to know how many times you're going to do this. I like what you said, transition funding is. Right. It has shifted up to grants. It's not happening. 180 degrees in 6 months. It's never happened in the history of program implementation. So that's the goal.
Yeah, she looks lovely. She does. She's actually sending us questions, and I know my email.
In preparation of meetings, I just don't forget to shut on meetings. Me and Tony maybe meet with you and Councilmember Gonzalez just to make sure we've actually covered all the breadth that you all need. I just in preparation for this.
We have 2 more meetings. Tony's chairing the next one, and then we're back to I think LG.
But I know we also held a date for potential add-on meeting, and I'm just trying to assess at this moment. I was really trying to cement, and the central stuff is amazing, because I was like, we need to just hone everything down to the salient points at this point.
No, this is good.
A
well-organized agenda and well-organized.
But I just want to make sure we're meeting the needs of what you all need, knowing you're going to be reporting out to the committees now. I wanted to be a co-chair to help you do your work.
It's very generous of you.
The folks it's a good group. The folks are really putting in time.
I know. Well, how about that? Yeah, not just coming and showing up, but actually doing the behind the scenes work.
That's right. That's permanent assistance. That's a very different use. It's a good chart. I mean, that's talk about it. The last. That's what this is.
I usually find there's asking people
Organizing 101, ask high, they'll meet it. And the other thing is the depth of these conversations. I mean,
yes, I would rather
last year's conference and the university.
one thing to try to get a handle on.
Doing that
Because the dollars
we would have had 5 minutes. A pure conversation, and we were able to hone it down. We looked back at the resolution. I said, let's look at the resolution. There are some limitations here and respond to them. Because some folks were coming out.
So mental, right. When you said mental issues, as opposed to drug addiction,
Staffing
or both?
implementation, I was like, no, that is not the right? I was like, appreciate what it helps. This is not the work of this.
Like to see
So,
money spent
coming out of
for-
probably yesterday's Housing for All meeting, you know, there's this email campaign.
But the amount of people you can really touch
And
or
they are
and it's very small. Yeah.
led by our
I'm not convinced that
savvy
this
Katie
does that at all.
But I think a question, I mean, again, like I said, the number is the number. It was identified as a resolution and included public input.
a range, I felt like, in that resolution.
Right. And so, like, this concept of going from the range in the resolution to nearly, double. I'm going to talk to her afterwards. I'm hoping in her mind that, because she's smart, she's savvy, she's seen how, what people go through, what their life is. I'm hoping she is open to parking some portion of her year in other revenue sources category. Because there's no way we can do an EHT that's going to raise $140 million a year.
So the ambulances aren't picking up drunks.
It was too fast, but it was a very systemic that had a really specific dollar amount attached to it. So if that number gets bigger,
Basically,
those
she
questions
pushed everybody under one roof and had them all.
This was, I'm so glad they did this. And they, even though there wasn't legal advice, a context of how it relates to other current policies was very, I was going through, I was like, okay, no.
Well, just not just what we can do, but like this does not. All of these things do nothing but reduce regressivity. And if we reduce regressivity without another fund source, then we're actually reducing the number of funds. So,
And something that's not stated in the capital
Or your
that isn't
recommendation.
given is that there's an income tax that's giving you a sustainable base. Because why wouldn't you assume that when 43 states do it? They assumed.
yes, and a couple hundred local jurisdictions as well.
And so we're at a deficit in that space. What I'm interested in, well, one, I don't know if you watched what's happening in Olympia around the Richter conversation. That's really interesting. And there were some unlikely supporters amongst the group. The committee conversation was very interesting.
I'm unaware of that. Tell me more about that.
Well, I mean, I think there had been this sort of amongst the Democratic caucus that they weren't going to get any mental pirates. Which is like, what it is the need in those areas, right? And so there are now artists and parties that are like, I'm going to entertain a conversation, right? So they're not going to get traction on this short session, but there's going to be traction at committee, which I think opens up potential for an organizing stream next year, right? And so there was some great testimony given. There was some organizing out of Spokane and Yakima.
Yeah, I've been tracking that. I just didn't know about the unlikely allies.
And some of that I've heard some behind the scenes stuff.
He's from a small town in Virginia, very
So that's exciting. And there's more and more traction on the income tax. I think, the Walmart, there's some who are like, we might win this lawsuit. Like, between 30 and but it set a new context for the conversation, which I that's like when I started conversating. So when we went to college, if the conversation started, we tried that, it didn't work. Instead of a concept, maybe we're going to give it her time in the way that was introduced didn't work versus the idea. And at least now there's a reset of people like, okay, I'm not doing the idea again. And I had to pay 10 years debating without a bigger context of conversation.
Sure, the only
Yeah, so I feel like no one was going on this I think a lot of people just got with
so that actually feeds the fire for opposition, right?
Yeah. All right, if you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. Thank you all. So again, if you can write down even a sketch of the notes from your conversation. We're now actually going to transition into the public comment period.
That's me.
Give all the paper from your conversation to me, and I will work with folks to get that written up, just so we can reflect on that and move forward with some of that in the next meeting. And Councilmember Herbal.
All right. So we've got public comment. We've got 4 people signed up here. If we could have public comment for 2 minutes per person, that would be great. We'll have Kathy Olson, followed by Sue Hodes.
And is there a mic where we're directing people to? Hodes, I'm sorry. Is there a mic that we're directing people to, or?
We don't have amplified sound, so anyone.
All right.
How about they can sit where I am, and that way they can be heard right here.
Kathy? I guess we don't need to worry about that. It's in the right spot.
Thank you, and good morning. My name is Kathy Olson. I'm here as a Seattle citizen, also as a person of faith. I attend Woodland Park United Methodist Church in the Greenwood area, and we have been a share shelter host, indoor shelter host, for over 20 years. We also host Hammond House for homeless women, and we've participated in the Road to Housing program. Through my work with Church Council of Greater Seattle and my faith community, I've become aware of the important work that you're doing here to address the issues of homelessness and housing in Seattle. I'd like to mention just a few of the issues that I find critical that I would hope that you would address. One is there is a need for vehicular programs to provide safe parking and parking fee forgiveness for the 40% of homeless people who are living in their vehicles and RVs. I advocate, as you've been talking, to a return to transitional housing as a method of getting people into to permanent housing. And I also see a need to work with faith communities who would like to partner with the city to provide services for homeless groups. We have hosted, as I said, SHARE for over 20 years, and we do this gladly, but it's not without cost. We estimate that we spend at least $4,000 a year in utilities, heat, maintenance, things like that. And we've become a community for a portion of the homeless population. So we encourage a healthier relationship between political and faith institutions. Additionally, I'd like to emphasize the power that this body has to shore up the life-giving resources that have been cut because of the RFP process this last fall. The Share Wheel program, hygiene centers, women-specific supportive services, just to name a few, are essential to offering dignity and safety to the homeless people in Seattle. So with the bridge funding running out soon for some of these organizations, a revenue from a progressive tax would be a way of shoring up some of these services. I thank you very much for the important work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sue Hodes will be followed by Jean Darcy.
Hi, I'm Sue Hodes with the Housing for All Coalition in the Neighborhood Action Coalition District 2. I want to thank everybody here for doing policy work, data crunching. It's so important on that aspect of things to change our homeless situation, and that's not my forte. At this point, what I'm doing is going to unsanctioned encampments in my district. I'm present there when they've been swept. Like one that's really been painful to me is Denver, and second, where Neighborhood Action Coalition District 2 has been relating since the summertime. I know a lot of the people there. And talk about the Me Too movement. The women being abused. Well, we see that all over on all levels. But do you know what's happening in swept encampments? Women are going back to abusers. Why? I'm talking specific women that I know. They're going to couch surf on their ex's RV parked somewhere because it's so dangerous to be a female on the streets. One woman told me when she was in a tent, she's sleeping with a baseball bat. Another woman just said she went with her ex-abuser because having the hard door of an RV is better than being in a soft tent. So the cuts that was done to women's shelter beds is beyond my imagination. And sorry if I'm talking loud. I'm so upset. It's taking me a while since these sweeps to feel okay. And for the first time, I've found the people again. They're calling us and we're staying in touch with each other. So speaking about sanctioning encampments and hearing about that Pope report seems wrong. One of the women that I know from the Denver sweep has moved from sleeping with the baseball bat underneath the tarp to a Nicholsville tent. Now, the Nicholsville tent, I visited her there when I finally found her again, and it's hard to find people. And she said she feels safe. It's cold in that tent. She's not in a tiny house. There aren't enough tiny houses. This is to say we need more. We need more, what do you call it, sanctions encampments. That Pope report is wrong, and let's see if there's any other. The gap tax, we're calling it the gap tax that Katie is proposing when an executive makes 1 billion times more than an employee that the employer should do it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Jean Darcy will be followed by Jean Minetti.
Let's see, these are not mine. Huh? Yeah, you know, I couldn't remember if that's mine or not.
My testimony has to do with how some of the revenue that's generated here could be used. I've been a volunteer for about 7 years doing outreach to vehicles that are in violation of the scofflaw ordinance. I'd like to share some observations I've made through my contacts with vehicle residents and with the police and the court over those years. My hope is that these may be useful to you in deciding how to use some of the revenue that would result from your work. I'm getting positive feedback on the way FAS, that's Finance and Administrative Services, is now managing the Soto Safe Lot. That's the only one in the city. The lot appears orderly with clear rules of behavior. FAS and the community police team continue to monitor the situation, and that was definitely not the case early on. It was kind of a mess. Now it's much more orderly. There is still room for improvement, however, as there is no case management since the Road to Housing program was not renewed. There's nothing for vehicles. If an agency were hired to do case management and FAS were funded to do the oversight and operation, that could be a model for more such sites, provided land were identified to locate them. Currently, FAS is operating the Soto lot with no additional funding, so I doubt they'd be able to expand to oversee more lots without the necessary budget. RVs continue to be a flashpoint for businesses and residents, so if more of them could be gotten off the street and into a sanctioned safe parking situation, I think a lot of the complaints would die down. In addition, if law enforcement assisted diversion, or LEAD, were engaged to address the bad actors, as it was in Belltown, I expect citizen complaints would die down significantly. And if case management were offered to those in the safe lots, some of the vehicle residents would be able to leave their vehicles and get into housing with necessary services. I hope these suggestions may be useful to you in your deliberations. And I would add also that given the race and social justice issue, I think safe lots should be distributed equitably around the city. Every district should be shouldering some of that responsibility.
I have a question related, and I'm wondering if Jean or council members know whether that FAS function is part of what got moved to HSD mid-year.
Nothing's been moved to HSD yet.
No, not yet. It's what's scheduled to move to HSD. No?
Jean Minetti.
I have, in fact, two proposed resolutions for you. If you'll bear through a little bit of dicta as we work up to it. I'll have to say, you know, I'm really disappointed with the committee. The kinds of kinds of suggestions for taxation that I've seen here. And the vague, ambiguous uses to which it's proposed to put them are all very disappointing. You have here a land value tax which is going to exempt improvements. Now, many countries have a vacancy tax. It's just the opposite of what you're proposing. What you're proposing is a squeeze the land out of the old-timers' hands so that the developers can get a hold of it and build something big idea. That's what's going to happen. People who are sitting on vacant land, and perhaps it should be taxed with everything else that's taxed, but not in exception, not in exclusion to itself. People are sitting there for what? Sentimental reasons, incompetency, perhaps even speculation. But for whatever reason, these people want to get the last of that land out of these people's hands. What they do in other countries, they go the other way. If you have a building that people could be living in, and this would solve a certain percentage of our homeless problem by itself, they tax the empty building. If you've got a house and it's sitting vacant, in the current tax structure, and it's been this way for 50 years, I remember when I was a kid, the guy that owned the house next door was a doctor, and he bragged that he made more money using it as a tax write-off vacant than if he rented it out. He was waiting for the land values to raise, for the rents to raise, then he'd make use of it. But he was getting more as a tax write-off from the empty building. Now,
Thank you, Mr. Minetti.
Can I then just make the two suggestions? I'd like to make a resolution that we consider just the opposite of this land value tax, consider a vacancy tax on empty land. Get a committee to find out how many houses are out there that are vacant the banks have been sitting on for the last 10 years. And secondly, I'd like to see a standing committee on examining the efficiency of our programs. Now, we had the RV park in Ballard, which ran $32,000 a month in cost. Now, why was that? Where did that money go? What went wrong there? We should have a committee, and I'd like to be on it, to investigate this situation and find out who's been the rat that's been nibbling at the cheese, huh?
Thank you. Appreciate it. To officially close us down?
Yeah, so just some notes. So we're moving into meeting 4. Community co-chair Tony Toe is going to facilitate that meeting. And in that, we're going to dig into more of the decision-making capacity. If folks can hand their notes in to me to be reconciled and sent back out to the group. And I think we're adjourned for the day. Thank you so much.